Good afternoon. Thank you, so many of you, for being here, joining us to celebrate and to discuss the publication of Quinn Slobodian's Hayek's Bastards, Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right, just published by Zone Books, I think, last month. It is out now, and there are copies for purchase outside in case you somehow miss them on the way in. There are many faces here that I don't recognize. So I'm Stefanos Geroulanos. I'm the director of the Remark Institute, where I work with Sam Paul, Danny Nguyen, and Lauren Lee, whom you would have met downstairs. Together with us to discuss the book are Hannah Gais, who works on white nationalism, neo-Nazis, and the broader far right at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and who publishes regularly in the Southern Poverty Law Review's Law Center's Hate Watch, turned it into Law Review, in the New Republic, the Baffler, Jewish Currents, and elsewhere. Ed Ongweso, who studies political economy and technology and a senior researcher at Security and Context, and also the co-host of the podcast This Machine Kills. And virtually, he can see us, but we can't see him yet. Michel Feher, founder and co-editor of Zone Books, and author most recently of Producteurs et Parasites, L'imaginaire si désirable du Rassemblement National from 2024, Producers and Parasites, the so desirable imaginary of, well, I kind of messed it up, of the French National Rally. And before that, of Rated Agency, Investee Politics in a Speculative Age, which was published by Zone in 2018. I don't really think that Quinn needs a formal introduction. You wouldn't be here. Some of you may not know that a couple of years ago, he moved from Wellesley, where he taught for many years, to BU. And most of you won't know that he graduated from the history department at NYU, working with Molly Nolan. Where are you, Molly?
Right up in front.
There you are. So it's a pleasure to have you back with us. Now, otherwise, his books, Globalists and Crack Up Capitalism, are perhaps the most significant and influential books in recent intellectual history to blend intellectual history with political economy and the history of the far right and its financial and intellectual financial devices. It's a little excessive, but not too excessive, to say that globalists single-handedly killed off the idea, broadly accepted, at least among academics before, that neoliberalism simply undid states or hated the states and replaced it with a sense that the key neoliberal imperative was for the state to wall off markets. Hayek's Bastards expands on this trajectory. It is a major contribution to 20th and 21st century history, as well as to the history of the present, especially the question of how did we end up with the far right that we have today. Quote from the introduction, sorry to do this. It was not just that neoliberals denied that they had won the Cold War, they were afraid of the reality that would result if they actually had, he writes, introducing the parallel obsessions of neoliberal thinkers with an approach to nature that insists on racial inequality and on IQ superiority. He goes on, this is the only long quote I'm going to do. Confounded by persistent demands for the redress of inequality at the expense of efficiency, stability, and order, neoliberals turn to nature in matters of race, intelligence, territory, and money as a way to erect a bulwark against the encroaching demands of progressives and hopefully roll back social changes to return to a hierarchy of gender, race, and cultural difference that they imagine to be rooted in genetics as well as tradition. From there follows the triad of hardwired human nature, hard borders, and hard money. Quinn argues that whatever disagreements they had with one another, a generation of neoliberal thinkers leading to Millet and Ramaswamy agreed on this vision of unequal science and on a vision of stability in which racial homogeneity strengthened itself through a quantification and hierarchy of human subjectivity. The last part that I want to mention, that they, meaning Charles Murray, Murray Rothbard, Gerald Rudnitsky, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, and a whole assortment of other ideological entrepreneurs, betrayed a certain vision that they adopted, Hayek's, and that they came to live and think with the new right, far right, alt-right, call it what you would like to, which is much more their offspring than a counterpoint. It is here that Quinn's voice actually gets clearest in the book. And this book has a force of expression that was not merely as put together before, only in elements. It's what makes it really a pleasure to read at this point. I want to add one more note of admiration, which is that both Quinn and I came of PhD age, I suppose, at a time when intellectual history was either meant to be, let's say, dry and very cautious about politics, or otherwise straight up persecutorial. I used to hate this persecutorial variety. It generally amounted to a sort of, I'm an intellectual historian, therefore I'm an intellectual. And then it added, I'm a liberal and everybody else is wrong, and I will attack. It was kind of awful, like having to justify quite regularly if you read people who were not officially approved. Now, as intellectual histories value in recent debates and politics is becoming clearer again, versions of this old persecutorial model survive, as it is easy to do. But it is to Quinn's immense credit that as we read this book, we see both his irony and his forceful calling out of bad ideas and bad intellectual practices. And yet we also see him reading authors who often hold absolutely detestable beliefs, reading them and paying attention to them with great care. We see him synthesizing both diagnosis and critique. And this, to my mind, is ultimately the true effect of a critical theory and of a history as a study that conceives of itself as a study of where the present came from and where it is going. So please join me in welcoming Quinn, as well as Hannah and Michel.
Okay, so I'm just going to say a couple things that are mostly just shout outs to people in the crowd before we start. As Steph just said, I went to NYU down the street here and was lucky enough to be advised by Professor Molly Nolan here in the front row. And one person who showed up I was happy to see is Dagmar Herzog. Where is she? But it was someone that showed up in an early seminar that I was in with Marion Kaplan. And I was just remembering after we talked in the hall that when I was writing my first book, I kept her book, Sex After Fascism, on my desk because when I was stuck and I didn't know how you were supposed to write a good book, I would just pick it up and open it up to a random page and read a couple pages and be like, right, that's how you write a good book. I got to try to do it like that. So that's a pretty close inspiration. It's wonderful to have her here. And the people who I invited to be part of this panel also just like are really important for this project in different ways. I've been working on it definitely since 2017, which is when this narrative, I think, launched 2016 about Trump and Brexit and the AfD as a backlash against neoliberal globalization, narrative that I never really found that persuasive when you looked at the people who were actually leading that supposed charge of, redemption for the left behinds, people like the think tankers inside of the Trump administration, the ordo liberal economists who founded the Alternative for Germany party, the devout Thatcherites who were at the heart of the Leave campaign and its launching. So the intellectual lineages and genealogies that I started to tease out then were in their infancy, I guess, in 2016, 17. I think the first time I proposed what is basically chapter 2 of this book was at Harvard's Center for European Studies, and Hannah was there because she was still at the Harvard Divinity School doing her master's. And I was surprised to see that there was someone who knew what I was talking about. So I started talking about Rothbard and Hoppe, and Hannah was like, yes, go on, I know this. And everyone else was like, who are these people? So since then, we've stayed on the same track of inquiry in different ways, and she's probably the only person who can really understand how funny it is that Peter Brimelow is now so actively posting about my book on X.com. Ed Ongweso, we've never actually met in person, but I've got so much from his writing and his podcasting over the years, and we've had some of my most memorable fun times just hashing through these ideas because we share so much of the background knowledge that I feel like when we talk, we can kind of go a little bit further than I'm usually able to go. So it's a real privilege and honor to have you here as well. And then in a minute, we'll see Michel Feher up on the screen, without whom this book wouldn't exist because he's literally the publisher. And is also someone who in 2017, I sat in a cafe in Paris and talked about this with. Before I came out with Crack Up Capitalism, Michel was basically like, you shouldn't really write that book. You should actually write this other book. And that book was this, Hayek's Bastards, which now we pulled it off, so that's great. And it turns out the right is still around. So there's relevance, sadly. And then lastly, just to Steph for the invite, I think, what especially Stefanos' last book about invention of prehistory shows a kind of interest in the most fundamental questions of human nature as being highly political, and the stuff of politics also not just to understand, but to try to actively think with and think through. And that's actually a way that my book and his last book are not so far apart. In fact, I think that the bastards of Hayek that I described share this belief that human nature is the terrain on which politics has to begin. And so an understanding of what motivates people, like from prehistory to the present, is actually not cosmetic or superficial to the basic political demands. It's actually the substrate on which you have to build a set of more profane material demands and questions. So I think with that, I'll just see what my interlocutors have to say, and we'll go from there.
We didn't get to plan the order, but so if you
Yeah.
want to go first.
Sure, why not? Unsurprisingly, I'm going to talk about Peter Brimlow a bit.
Tell people who he is, yeah.
Yes. But first, I just want to say I've been following Quinn's work for years, as he mentioned. So I am now a reporter and researcher focused on the radical right, particularly the white nationalist and neo-Nazi movements. And his work has been very instructive. I think one of the things that's really missing in this field, and it's definitely not a very thinly veiled secret, is that a lot of the academic work and as well as the reporting and journalistic analysis on this topic, I mean, it often fails to address the intersection between race and immigration, as well as market and economics. I think as journalists, academics, we've done all right in describing basically how the movement engages in emotional manipulation of its adherents through fear and these compelling narratives about returning to a particular kind of tradition. But one of the things that we've often really ignored is how it's managed to make inroads with tech and big capital. And as we saw from this past election, that wins elections. To me, Hayek's Bastards really helps fill this gap. It provides us with a fresh look at the movement and its the resurgence of the far right within the United States and abroad. Not just through the first and second Trump administrations, but I mean, also kind of the building that they were doing during the Biden years. It really does challenge those of us who do this work, who may be inclined to brush off the movement as just reactionary or backwards, and also just to take them at their word that they want to return to a or the past. But it also challenges us to see this resurgent far right as not just separated from the neoliberal order, but its mutated spawn. So I think in the moment, these connections can be kind of difficult to explain. Think of the moment the mob of Tiki Torch marchers walked through Charlottesville in summer of 2017, shouting, "Jews will not replace us." Think about what questions might come about their motivations. You don't necessarily, maybe you do, I don't know, I'd be impressed if you do, think, what do these guys think of the welfare state? Or is what these angry young men appear to be asking for higher tariffs so we can usher in an age of autarky? Those questions might be kind of goofy in context, but I think they're also important to why the far right has ultimately succeeded in the ways that it has. So look no further than one of Hayek's Bastards' most vocal subjects, Peter Brimlow. Peter Brimlow publishes a website called Feher. It's been around since 1999. I don't think they have, well, it's defunct now. I'll get to that in a second, but I don't think they have updated the website structure since 1999. It looked very, very much like classic blogosphere. So me and my colleagues are used to thinking of Peter Brimlow as a white nationalist and a nativist. So he and his fans in the Trump administration, they'll deny that first characterization. They might quibble about the second. And well, Peter would get really mad at me if I didn't remind everyone that he didn't actually attend Unite the Right. He didn't. Don't get mad at me, Peter. A lot of his contributors and collaborators did. Yet, as Quinn reminds us, Brimlow and thus Feher were born out of this debate around within the neoliberal right over immigration and borders. The position that Peter Brimlow staked then and continues to stake now is basically the one that has won out on the right. So to him, free market shouldn't require open immigration. In fact, even though the fact that Peter Brimlow is an immigrant, he doesn't really want it to involve immigration at all. In fact, he wants to close the border to keep out the wrong people. So Brimlow's website isn't publishing anymore. He's been involved in this long back and forth with the New York State Attorney General. That's way too complicated to get into. But his influence and those who think like him has lived on in the mainstream right, and I don't think it can really be understated. On Inauguration Day, he and his wife Lydia, they traveled from their castle in West Virginia to enjoy the festivities at the Heritage Foundation. And yes, this man does own a castle. Yes, it is in West Virginia. I've been there. It's a bit weird. To make a long story short, he tried to make me drink lukewarm vodka. I was there as a reporter, to be clear. I mention all of this just in case you wake up in the morning and you're wondering, whose world are we living in? I mean, I don't have to remind you guys who published Project 2025. So are we doing questions for you now, or is he talking?
We'll compile them so Quinn can add it later.
Okay.
But go ahead and ask.
Well, so basically, I mean, going back to Peter Brimlow's X feed, why did you choose to focus on Brimlow? And I mean, there's so many different characters within the alt-right. I guess what we would have called the alt-right. I don't really use that term anymore. But why him particularly? And I was also kind of curious, a lot of the figures that you focus on are really obsessed with this idea of purges. Everyone's been purged from the conservative movement at some point in time. It's a current you find within a lot of far right, kind of ex-mainstream conservative types. What do you make of this outsider status within kind of the current regime? I think those are the two for now.
Should I respond?
No, hold on.
Okay.
For after
All
that.
right. Then.
This Quinn's work has been really, I think, integral for me in this period, because I've been trying to, in my writing about the political economy of technology, understand part of the legitimacy crisis that capitalism is undergoing and the way in which techno-capitalists are trying to take advantage of it. And in the process of this legitimacy crisis, there's a lot of discourse or insistence that we are leaving capitalism, and that these reactionaries and their ascendants and their emergence signal a turn towards feudalism or towards monarchism. But I think that engagement with Quinn's work has been really helpful in grounding the fact that this is part of a longer turn or struggle by reactionaries to not only re-legitimize natural hierarchy, but to try to discover more lasting, more permanent forms that amend themselves to capitalism more than liberalism or some liberalism inflected ones. And so the parts of the book that, the pillars of the book, I think a lot, or have been thinking a lot about how we discuss and talk about race and IQ and gold, hard money and borders and wiring of humans is so, I think, deficient in that it allows for the debates to be about how we are turning away from capitalism instead of reaffirming core elements of it with it, and thinking, for better or for worse, that capitalism is incompatible with these more reactionary elements. And I, one of the things I'm looking forward, I guess, to talk to Quinn about today, and also that comes through the book, is what are the consequences that emerge when we get lulled into the sense that actually capitalism and liberalism are compatible, that actually there are institutions or levers embedded in it which will push out or keep us safe from the threats that emerge from people who are interested in skull measuring, right? And for put it bluntly, I guess. These are guys who the vision for which they are proposing, as Quinn talks about in the book and also in a lot of writing that's come out after and before the publication, seeking an inhuman future that would or could result in something that's worse than capitalism. But it's not necessarily, there doesn't necessarily need to be that break, right? The push for these sort of caste-like institutions, the push for these remote forms of terror, the push for segregation, the push for these theories about human nature that would justify increasingly authoritarian and discriminatory and hierarchical forms of life can exist inside of capitalism. And I feel like that realization is something I don't see a lot of when we talk about technology. There's this insistence, even now, I think most recently, when Silicon Valley, turned pretty hard for Trump, there's this insistence that, these have been enlightened, if not slightly libertarian individuals. When the history actually shows, that most of them have been obsessed with, these very things, with how do we relegitimize the old order, the old regime, right? Or how do we discover something that's a little bit more durable? How do we protect, the real minority, right? The billionaires or the elites that we're interested in organizing society around, from the others, from the hordes that are interested in undermining undermining capitalism with democracy or with egalitarian ethics. And so I think the broad question I think I would have is I would love to talk about what got you to one distinguish between race and IQ, because I feel like that's also I feel like that's a blind spot in a lot of discourse about reactionaries and their attempts to do this a new sort of to rejuvenate capitalism, right? That there's a focus on race and maybe on the racism of specific people, on their interest in segregation, but not so much in the fact that they want to or are interested in designing a social order organized around caste or organized around forced segregation, right? Or voluntary segregation, as Rockwell would hum about. And for IQ, I think there's a lot of focus and coverage, for example, of the transhumanist who insist that we will be able to augment and engineer ourselves, and that this is going to lead to a better future for humanity. But not so much attention paid to the fact that the other side of this is fanatic interest in sterilization or, in hard lines in organizing what type of work, where people get to, live, or roles that they play in society based on IQ. That, as Hannah kind of alluded to, amount to purges in one way or another, or building up the apparatus for these purges. And the kind of superficial engagement with race and IQ has left us kind of surprised when figures emerge, it feels like, right? When they articulating or advocating for violence, for mass amounts of violence, or for reorganization of society along these sorts of lines. And then for gold, similarly, I think with a lot of the interest or a lot of the reporting, I think of but maybe follows a superficial track, might be focusing on crypto's propensity for speculation and crime, and less so on the interest that these people have in figuring out alternative forms of sovereignty or alternative forms of governance and order. But in this book and in your writing, you have been really good at consistently bringing out those deeper trends and their ideological roots. So I think, when did you realize or decide that you were going to focus on deepening engagement with the ideas behind these, but also when did you, what was the process for thinking through race and IQ and how we're gonna disaggregate them and talk about, even though they overlap a bunch?
Thank you.
So hello, everybody. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me virtually. Very nice to be with you. So we're supposed to find an angle to talk about Quinn's book. And so The first angle was the far right. The second angle was capitalism. So I guess neoliberalism will be my spot, right? Because that's one of the most interesting, among many other things about Quinn's perspective is his very flexible, at the same time very precise and very flexible vision or conception of neoliberalism. He insists at several stages of his work that neoliberalism is not merely an economic rationality, it's not certainly market fundamentalism, but it's not even that economic rationality that, you know, from Foucault to Wendy Brown and others have developed. It's that, but it's also, or more, maybe more fundamentally, a certain worry and a certain insistence on the part of the intellectual that he studies to make sure that democracy or popular sovereignty will not get in the way of the freedom of capital. And that is a concern, a running concern that goes from the 1920s to today, and that take different forms. The worry takes different form in different sensible moment at different times. When the main issue is fascism or communism, it's one thing. When it's Keynesianism and social democracy, it's another. So things change, but the concern remains. But with a very interesting break, and one that one would not expect, and which I think is really an essential moment that Quinn has put his finger on and that he analyzes, which is the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War is supposed to be the victory of liberal capitalism, or it's supposed to be the victory of capitalism altogether. It's the defeat of the Russian and the fall of the Russian Empire. So you would imagine that neoliberals that have been fighting for that would be happy. However, and that is, I think, the crux, or at least the starting point of Quinn's work since 2016, 2017, is exploring the post-Cold War blues of neoliberal intellectuals. Their kind of depressive approach to the end of the Cold War. Not that they deny the fact that communism has fallen, but in a way, it doesn't change anything. Because you have possibility of other things coming up, like on environmentalism or feminism or things like that. Or even the welfare state is not gone. And then you have things like the European Union that could, you know, become kind of social democratic. It didn't, but it could have. So things are not as good as they seem. So what is interesting, and that's the other, I think, remarkable starting point of Quinn's work since 2017, is the way they fight depression. Because they were not the only ones to be depressed at the end of the Cold War. Us lefties were kind of depressed too, for different reasons. But they dealt much better with their depression than we did, in the sense that it gave them new ambitions. Whereas we were sort of keep wondering what went wrong, what went wrong, what went wrong. They just moved to something quite different. I mean, still in the realm of what they had developed before, but nonetheless quite different. To put it simply, instead of disciplining liberal democracy, which had been their main goal until then, they realized that maybe the time had come to do away with it altogether. And that is the work that you can see developed first in Crack Up Capitalism and then in Hayek's Bastard today. But I think that without the recognition of that depression, which is also related with another thing that Quinn already points out in Globalists, which I think is a very important point of Globalists, which is the fact that neoliberals never really cared that much about the Cold War. Because for them, between a Keynesian and a Stalinist, what's the big difference? So there was something there, a seed that was there, and that really could blossom from 1989 on. But then there's also kind of a genealogical turn within that post-1989 turning point, which is the fact that if you look at Quinn's work, I mean, the long arc of Quinn's work from Globalist to Hayek's Bastard, you realize that his vision of neoliberals has something Albert Hirschman-like about it. The Albert Hirschman of, voice, exit, loyalty. In the sense that the neoliberals of the globalists of that time were very much about voice, were very much about voicing their opposition to what they saw as the creeping socialism of the Keynesian post-war world order. But then after 1989, and that's the object of Crack Up Capitalism, they went from voice to exit, in the sense that, in fact, disciplining democracy was getting a little bit tiresome, and it was kind of a thankless job. So why not escape it? Why not create this free zone without democratic oversight where we could finally have the lives that we always wanted to have? So that's the moment of exit. But then comes Trump 2.0, more than Trump 1.0. And there we have a third stage maybe of neoliberalism, and that would be my question to Quinn, whether he would go with that, where we're going from exit to loyalty, in the sense that, at least in the US, and thanks to Trump, instead of creating free zones in Dubai or wherever else in little islets offshore, maybe we could turn the United States, and then who knows what after that, into a free zone if we followed our new leader, or at least our new guide. And so there is this sort of passage from exit to loyalty that seems to be in process. So that would be my main question. And if I have time for a second one, which is also related to Quinn and neoliberalism. So Quinn insists often on the fact that he doesn't buy the discourse that the new far right, the Trumpist far right in the US, was a rebellion, ill-directed for sure, but a rebellion against neoliberalism. What he shows, and my people came before me showed it very well, is that it was a mutation of neoliberalism and not a reaction against it. So that is true, but at the same time, Quinn's work also insists on the fact that things happen, because there is another discourse on the left. There is one discourse on the left that says that, in fact, we may not like Trumpism and we may hate Trumpism, but it was nonetheless a deserved comeuppance for globalism or global neoliberalism. But then there's another discourse on the left also that says, in fact, Trump didn't change very much. You look at the tax codes, you look at the freedom of movement for capital. In fact, behind the theater of Trumpism and the pseudo-paleoconservative of Trumpism, it's just the continuation. Imperial America is Imperial America is Imperial America. And I think that Quinn is as strongly opposed to that discourse too, because the mutation is decisive there. So these would be my two little provocation for him. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel.
Okay, so thanks, everybody. I've been asked to give a bit more of an overview of the book for people who haven't had a chance to read it. So you know if you want to buy it, what you're getting into, I suppose. And the approach I take in the book is reflected a bit by the homage I'm giving to the author John Ralston Saul in the title. So a fellow Canadian who wrote this book, Voltaire's Bastards, in the late 1990s, that was a great inspiration to me as a teenager. This was more like the mid 1990s, in which he took the original Enlightenment idea of reason and then followed individuals who believed they were acting in the spirit of rationality and rationalization to opt in barbarous ends. So McNamara, industrialization of slaughter and the Holocaust and so on become some of the ways that he talks about Voltaire's bastards. So similarly, in this book, I use a select group of individuals and intellectuals as sometimes causal agents, but more often kind of observers of larger goings on. Peter Brimelow is one. Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein are very much two more. Murray Rothbard is another. His protege, Hans Hermann Hoppe, is another. And there is, read badly, I think there'd be the danger of me saying, like, these people are the puppet masters of the present moment, and that's not my intention. And rather, the point is that they often played some hand in or else helped to prefigure or foreshadow certain shifts in the larger zeitgeist that then they were often able to successfully post to more positions of influence on the crest of. So, for example, in that period when Hannah saw me give this talk for the first time, I was looking at this collected YouTube documented speeches of something called the Property and Freedom Society that Hans Hermann Hoppe had founded as a kind of alternative to the Montpellier Society, who's gathering in this ballroom on the Turkish Riviera in Bodrum, a hotel owned by his wife, with the strangest group of people you've ever seen in your life, like South African, Afrikaner Boer separatists, Swiss banker, investors, gold, precious metals consultants, German historical revisionists. And superficially, it made no sense at all, like why these people would all be in the same room, let alone speaking on the same panel. Why is, Peter Brimelow or Jared Taylor, founder of Our American Renaissance, or Richard Spencer himself, who would become so well known as the leader of the alt-right movement here, they seem to have so little in common. But what they had in common was a belief that the conservative movement had betrayed them and that they needed to restake out a new form of politics that was not just, I think, as Hannah said, going back to this or that imagined past. That was actually not an act of melancholy. So to Michel's points about leftist melancholy after the end of the Cold War, you could say that the people I'm writing about like properly mourned. So they knew that the Cold War was dead and they needed now to move on to a new struggle. And the question then became, what is the nature of this new struggle? What is the new enemy? What's the new terrain? And what kind of perhaps strange allies and forms of kinship do we need to create now to fight against what has outlived communism in its formal sense? So that, I don't think I'm going to be able to go in order, but let me just sort of answer piecemeal the different kinds of questions that people are asking here, because this point that that Michel was raising about the post-Cold War blues relates in certain ways to the question that Hannah was asking about the purge logic. So the thing that is an archival discovery, so to speak, I think kind of spoke to me most was the speech that Charles Murray gave in the Galapagos Islands, beautifully, in front of, among others, Lida Cosmides and James Toobies, who people might know as the founders of evolutionary psychology, who were in attendance. Why were they in the Galapagos? Because many neoliberals, again, a kind of archival discovery in the 1990s and 2000s, decided that they needed to ground their authority much more firmly on the basis of the natural sciences and the human sciences, and that rather than the old fusionism, which as we know was about uniting religion and free markets, the new fusionism would be about making claims about economic freedom and individualism within the market on the basis of scientific authority. That's the new fusionism that is an actor's category. Paul Gottfried, the same guy who defined alternativeright.com in the late 80s, said, hey, what we're doing here is the new fusionism, where we seem to be more interested in sociobiology and evo psych than we are in, languages of the gospels and, traditional morality. So Charles Murray in the Galapagos says what Michel was saying, which is we either didn't actually win or we're on the brink of winning, and both are equally alarming. So if we didn't win, that means statism and Leviathan outlived the Cold War, and state spending is still very high, welfareism is still very high. And so we still have the task of how can we smash up this incredibly persistent and stubborn set of, claims making and forms of legitimacy creation. So I think your point about legitimacy crisis is right on, that don't seem to actually have that much to do with ideology, right? Like it turns out that Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security aren't about people being socialists, just about them liking to having like the basic conditions of existence secured for them. So what happens if we didn't win and we're still left with the welfare state after the Cold War is over? How do we fight this new fight? Who are the new ideologues who are providing the language that's legitimizing the continuation of these things? Well, it's feminists, it's environmentalists, it's gay rights activists. It's all of these people who come under the umbrella of political correctness to them in the 1990s and would of course be called woke later. So part of the struggle is how do you now defeat this new enemy? It becomes equally as much of a problem as the Keynesians had been before and the post-colonial leaders had been earlier. But second of all, more troublingly, and that's the interesting part, what if we are on the brink of victory? And Murray says this outright. He says, right now we find ourselves closer to victory than we ever have been before. And it's now incumbent upon us to ask what we'll do the day after we actually win. And the state, as we know it, the social state, is dismantled. That's when he cites Herbert Spencer. And he says, well, Herbert Spencer said, when the opium addict is withdrawn from their drug, there is an extreme period of withdrawal that is painful. And sometimes the addict dies, but other times they're able to come out on the other side as a healthy person again. He says, some of us are too naive. We think that self-sustaining societies will spring out of the soil of society like Athena from the brow of Zeus. But what if we're wrong? And what if actually there needs to be a purge process? So the rest of the Herbert Spencer quote, if you go back and read it, says, the Victorian welfare state basically has kept alive masses of people who otherwise would never have lived at all. And a process of a return to true liberalism will mean the removal of those surplus bodies and lives from existence. So the idea that there will be a sortition process is something that is both on the minds of people as a day after scenario, and then also on their minds as a how do we start chipping away at the continued existence of like apparatuses of claims making that are like overly general and overly based on ideas of redistribution and equal access. So the restoration of vertical relationships of hierarchy is the matter of the day, not just to drill into and start to crack up the Leviathan, but also to start to reestablish from the bottom up the kind of small scale organic units that you will have to then use as the building blocks for post-state society. And that's sounds like I'm extrapolating wildly, but I'm not. That's like literally what they're saying. So when Murray Rothbard and Lou Rockwell go to the Rockford Institute in Illinois to meet these paleoconservatives of Sam Francis, Tom Fleming, that's what they're going there to do. And they have a series of meetings in something called the John Randolph Club, named after a slave owner whose famous slogan was, "I love liberty, I hate equality." And they're saying, what are the basic minimal conditions under which we, who actually have very different ideas of the world, could nevertheless collaborate? And they say, well, we need to build contractual communities, small scale, that are based on something other than representative government in the traditional form. And if we're not going to do normal laws and not do the normal state, then we need to be basing it on something else. So what do we have? Well, shared race, that's a good way to do it. How will we determine who will be in and out? Well, here's where IQ comes in. We know that race is not just, all races are not created equal. There is like an ordinal ranking of capacity within races according to the IQ science that they all uniformly celebrate. And so you can then also make choices about like who's in and who's out based on where people stand on this ordinal ranking of race. So it's a social engineering project, like in the purest sense, in that they're trying to like cobble together a new non-liberal, actually, in the sense that not in the tradition of the Republican citizenship that we all learn about from the American and French Revolution onward. This is an alternative form of political membership that they're grasping around in all of the disciplines to figure out the building material for. And often anthropology, often genetic science, often pop psychology. And that attention to those often kind of thinly understood elements of human sciences is one of the things I think is quite interesting that starts to get me close to some of Ed's questions, because the 1990s were also a time when I think appeals to science became a kind of lingua franca for middle brow populations in the United States, especially, right? I mean, this is the time when books like The Moral Animal, when Stephen Pinker's books, The Blank Slate, Troublesome Inheritance, different discussions about how we actually can't just make and remake society. There are certain things that are hardwired into us from our evolution. There are certain, maybe even hierarchies that exist between humans that, however uncomfortable, need to be reckoned with. Hence the brilliance of the bell curve coming out when it did. It taps right into rising prestige of neuroscience. The Human Genome Project is going full blast. This moment that Rogers Brubaker describes when the cultural anthropologists have kind of lost the sovereignty of interpretation of what the human is and what human difference is, and it's actually being taken over by scientists, behind their back without them even realizing it. These new fusionists were really aware of that. They were watching that carefully, and they're like, oh, this is actually a great way of building a new form of politics that is able to leverage now new forms of authority, which the left has seemingly decided it doesn't need to think about, because the left has decided that race is just a construction that is cloaking the deeper structure of power. So I think, to your point, Ed, the question is, how are they going to create legitimacy in an era of what they assume to be actually something like post-mass consumer society that might also be realistically a time of scarcity, and that might even be a time of what you might conventionally call degrowth? Because that also, again, sounds strange, a book about capitalist radicals in which they're imagining scarcity and degrowth. But what is a gold bug prescription for a capitalist economy except a recipe to destroy a capitalist economy and reduce it to a much lower level of complexity, in which debt and credit relationships no longer lubricate, interlocked set of balanced exchanges, but has to think in terms of a reduced space of possibility and output legitimacy, right? So you're not going to be able to actually give people what they want anymore. So you're going to have to talk about, I guess, material fulfillments that are not strictly, like based on consumer access or variety in that same way, which is actually what's really compelling and kind of hardcore and radical about them. And all of it would be cat board stuff and like strange message board stuff. As Hannah was saying, like, why do we have to care about these people? What a shame. But I just came here from a chat with some friends about Alexander Karp's Technological Republic, and that's what that book is. That book is, we looked, democracy is mentioned 3 times only descriptively or dismissively in passing. So it's not going to deliver legitimacy through the consent of the governed in the traditional sense. The language of prosperity and growth and output legitimacy is basically absent. So it's actually not promising abundance or prosperity. What is it promising, actually? It's promising like a siege mentality, a hardening period in which like masculinity will be restored through confrontation with a perilous threat from the outside. And in the only way that we will make it through maybe this period of, Spartan hardship is by transferring all existing resources and agency that we have to a select or aristocracy of the tech soul who will be able to administer wisely and, most optimally a world where also machines have their own agency and things become much more unpredictable than they are. So that, again, sounds like, like I'm just spinning cobwebs here, but this is actually what the people in the book talk about. So that when they got together at these Montpellier Society meetings to have like a wake for Hayek in 1994, or they're getting together in Turkey, they're talking about like the entrepreneurial spirit of bacteria and the chimpanzee troop and what it can teach us about an evolutionary libertarianism in the 21st century. And they're actually trying to design what James Buchanan, I think, really helpfully and interestingly calls satellites. So he says, we have Hayek's story, which is like we started on the savannah in these small sharing communities of solidarity, but then thank God we got over that and started trading with anonymous exchange partners. And by the end of the story, we have the Great Society, which is the world economy, in which the great and diverse set of human abilities and resources can be drawn on and mediated through the price system to create the wonderful objects like Milton Friedman's pencil or Steve Jobs' iPhone. The neoliberals I describe here aren't so confident about that arc. So they're, first of all, they're saying, does it only go in one direction? Isn't there a danger that when institutions get created to encase the global economy, as the World Trade Organization has or the European Union has, that those become Trojan horses for actually a form of global redistributionism, that they are then, setting the stage for seizure by, our worst enemies, in effect? So don't we actually, rather than just saying we go from the savannah to globalism, need to build satellites, as Buchanan says, in which we understand that the world has a gravitational pull, which is that of the tribal drive, as he calls it, our desire to go back to the savannah and back to small group solidarity. And then there's also deep space, which is like globalism and then totally anonymized mass exchange. And we need to figure out what containers for human activity can like sit in low Earth orbit and take advantage of both without either hitting a fiery explosion on the soil or spinning off into deep space. But that's the way he puts it, right? And it's very ambitious. I mean, I have to say, like as a political and intellectual program, like, yeah, I mean, that's post-melancholic politics, right? I mean, that's like where you're actually trying to figure out how this stuff should go down. So let me say a couple of other things, because I know I'm going long here already, about what I hope to do with the book and try to respond a bit more directly to some of the questions. So first to Hannah's question about Peter Brimelow, like why Brimelow? So if you were, as she and I were, and Ed would have been too, in 2017, just reading those like explainers about the alt-right, one of the people who was inevitably be named to be Peter Brimelow, right? Like one of the godfathers of the alt-right, quote unquote, is this hate monger, white nationalist, nativist, Peter Brimelow, founder of VDare.com, named after Virginia Dare, the first white girl born in the New World. Fine. What wasn't mentioned, and what I found really interesting, was that he was a financial journalist for like 20 years. And wrote column after column in Fortune, in Forbes, in the Financial Post in Canada, in which he basically builds up his nativist theory. He builds up what you could call a theory of white nationalism. But he would describe it as a way of figuring out, via Milton Friedman, we introduced multiple times, what the meta market is, what the non-economic conditions are for free market society. And those are cultural, those are even racial, those are definitely based on a certain skill set, which can be correlated with a certain population subgroup. And so he comes to his nativism, or his white nationalism, if you like, through a totally methodical set of economic moves of reasoning. And through reference to Friedrich Hayek, through references to Ludwig von Mises, Thomas Sowell, Milton Friedman, which seemed to me immediately to kind of begin to expose in a way that I was really trying to in the book, that there is a kind of economism as well, and a capitalist rationality inside of what is often, as you said as well, described only in emotional affective terms. Something that's about like a longing for eternity, or like a desire to, transcend the modern world, being against the modern world in the right sense. It's definitely gesturing. Great, winding it down.
To give a little bit of time for questions.
Yes, absolutely. So that's why I was interested in Brimelow and seeing him as a product of the financial press, a product of like Reaganite conversations about what the conditions for the market should be, seemed to go some way in helping us understand this. Charles Murray is the same, right? Avowed libertarian coming out of the Manhattan Institute. Why does he change from basically behaviorism, being against welfare for single mothers, because he thinks it just rewards the universal human desire to have children because it makes us feel good, to thinking that there are, clearly defined set of groups that need to be re-understood as the basis for immigration policy and a positive and negative, maybe eugenic policy as well. So these people are often thinkers of capitalism rather than against capitalism, and in the narrow sense are also part of this One Pellerin Society milieu. Charles Murray is a member, Peter Brimelow speaks at the meetings. I'm not making leaps, but as Michel said at the beginning, the way I treat neoliberalism is both like very precise, but also very vast, because if you just use the criterion of exclusion, it's about people who are like somehow connected to Hayek and company, then that seems like, well, that's going to be a pretty simple story. But it turns out inside of that intellectual community, there's like very deep arguments and divisions about what the nature of human difference is, what the most important means of anchoring capitalist order is, and the book is an example of playing that out. So I'll just say one more thing and then love to hear questions from the audience, which is two more things. One is about transhumanism, which Ed gestured at, which I find very, and Bitcoin cryptocurrency ideology, which both seems like a refutation of what I'm writing about in the book, in the sense that it isn't a return to nature, a flight to nature, but the way transhumanists think about nature as modifiable could be seen actually as an even deeper devotion to nature, right? It's like they don't think they can change it because they think it's construction. They think that it is actually based in some hard materiality that is nevertheless amenable to invention. So I think they could easily be wound in here. And I will leave Michel's question about Trump 2.0 because I bet that's going to come up in the questions.
I was actually going to say, why don't we keep that as the last question and
Sure.
around like 2 o'clock to go for. So,
Yeah.
Molly?
Yeah, I really look forward to reading the book, but I have one sort of question about how do these people relate to what has been pretty much the blueprint for Trump 2.0, Project 2025.
Yeah.
Were they involved in any of it? Did people borrow from those ideas? And particularly one of the things that struck me reading through more hundreds of pages of it than I ever wish to
Yeah.
is how obsessed 2025 was with restoring ostensibly natural hierarchies of gender, forms of sexuality, the famous there are only two possible sexes determined at conception, et cetera, et cetera. Were your thinkers at all concerned with that, or were they focused much more on race rather than gender?
Yeah, so I think I can answer that fairly quickly. I mean, what I described as the hangover of the state after the Cold War is another way of describing like the administrative state, right? Or the managerial state, which is something that they all correctly saw as emerging in the 1920s and 30s, both middle management, big firms, but then also ultimately the enormous expansion of the civil service and the bureaucracy. So that the attempt to dismantle that is been one of the core projects for sure of the neoliberal and conservative intellectual class since the end of the Cold War. And the problem is it's incredibly stubborn because it emerged iteratively in a way that, ties people into the expectations that it then fulfills. And to do away with it is to suddenly divest people of a lot of the things that they thought they were being given in the social contract that they were implicitly part of. So that's been the conundrum, right? Is like how sticky welfarism is. Like once these things get rolled out, and regulations too, how you roll them back. And the destructionism that we're seeing now via Doge is, as we know from reporting, like basically stage managed by Stephen Miller, right? Who's, I think, sees that the mask of entrepreneurial genius and engineering mindset that Musk is able to wear is something that can actually build a little bit more credibility for the project than just like a Burnhamite vision of like destroying the Marxist bureaucracy, which is actually what someone like Miller or Rusbot actually believes in. So I think it's very much part of it. It's a practical side of this that I would never have anticipated when I was finishing this book was going to go as far as it has. And then secondly, very quickly on the question of gender, absolutely important. And I would say even to the point of legitimacy, I think the idea of restoring gender order in which men have dominance over women and have special roles of defense and value creation is one of the ways they hope to solve the legitimacy crisis. I think to give men a sort of sense of meaning back is one of those things that is being promised. And again, the Alexander Karp book, it's too good not to mention, only it features one illustration, which is Ulysses slipping from the bonds of the mast, being drawn into the water by the nubile sirens. And it says, just in case you're not getting the picture, the caption says something like Ulysses is drawn by the erotic feminine energy of the sirens in this image kind of a thing. So obviously you need to reverse that. And for sure, restoring gender hierarchy is, and the family, the procreative unit.
Okay, thanks. This was really wonderful. I'm excited to read the book. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just ask two quick ones. That's okay. One is, about the melancholy of mourning distinction.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, to me, it strikes me that one of the reasons that we often now talk about the left in the 90s and indeed maybe today as melancholic is because the love object, right, that they are supposed to be, or we are supposed to be mourning, is no longer accessible. That a kind of New Deal coalition politics based in, workforce that is heavily invested in American industry, right, and industrial unions is not on the table within the structures of global capital. What is the relationship between the kind of ideology that you're describing in this book and the structures of the shifts in capitalism against which, or in which it's taking place, right? That's the first question. And the second, very quickly, is just to ask you to elaborate on what I found to be a really provocative analogy that you give in the conclusion of the book, which is when you analogize the kind of neo-alt-right thinking to a form of investment strategy, where the investment strategy in this case is a kind of flight to safety, right? And as you say, that would normally in financial terms be described sometimes as a flight from stocks to bonds. And it's hard not to read that in, that description in light of, right, the recent troubling of the bond market precisely by the people who would be purportedly, right, putting forward this investment strategy invested in safety and security. So I'm just curious to hear you elaborate that metaphor a bit more.
Sure. Okay, so I'll try to do this quickly. First, on the idea of the material basis of the US economy, I think that actually is a big part of the chapter on Charles Murray, right? So I think that language of the knowledge economy and the information economy, and then not long after that, of course, the inflation of the dot-com bubble ended up being a very fertile soil for the new focus on what I call neurocastes, or like the privileging of IQ as the primary way of determining capacity within the competitive market in that era when being a good productive worker would be maybe more about, stamina or strength, then IQ might not be as important. But when it's about, manipulating objects and rotating things on the screen all day, then IQ is a natural fit. So I think they were well suited for that, to celebrate IQ as the primary form of human ranking in a moment when the material basis of American power was shifting. And of course, it goes without saying that then becomes one of the ways that they could create these alliances with the tech movement, because they too share that belief. I just wrote a piece in the Guardian about that. On the second question about the investment strategy, that allows me to actually shout out once again my friend and publisher here, Michel Feher, who has written well about this idea in his Rated Agency book. And I've struggled with it a bit because it seemed intuitively like a really catchy and memorable sort of analogy in a way. Martin Koning's and Melinda Cooper in different ways also have used this idea. We've all been working it out together. But first, the easy part, then the hard part. The easy part on the question you just asked is, of course, the more standard is flight to gold, and gold's doing great, right? So you could say this actually confirms the way that they're talking about things, because there is a natural value that is much even stronger than the US Treasury bill or stronger than bonds, which is gold. So one could validate that part of things. The hard part about the investment analogy is it's actually a very James Buchanan, Gary Becker type of way of thinking. It's actually something Gary Becker would have happily embraced, that through the economic way of thinking would suggest that we make political choices actually through questions of incentive and reward rather than something larger. So I wonder if it, unfortunately, through the back door ends up adopting some of the very framings that neoliberals themselves use or have used in the past. But I think, again, I recommend Michel's book, Rated Agency, because he talks about how one can use that language that you're proposing in ways against the people who are originally framing it. But then just very, very quickly, Michel's really interesting framing about crack up capitalism as the move from voice to exit and Trump 2.0 as the move from exit to loyalty. I think there's really something to that that helps answer the question too, which is that the further dialectical spin that's happened since even this book came out, in which to be part of MAGA means that you need to totally subjugate normal economic rationality to the supposedly higher wisdom of the great leader, brings us back to like chapter 1 of globalists, right? I mean, this is what the neoliberals in Paris at the Colloque Lippmann came together to oppose, was the way that dominium or arbitrary political decision-making had trumped imperium, or other way around. Imperium, or the law of politics, had totally trumped an idea of predictability or property. So the move to loyalty is actually the ultimate anti-neoliberal move in a way, because it privileges, in the end, politics absolutely over questions of economy, which ideally should transcend politics.
Right, Nicholas, and then right.
Thank you. This was great. In this overview you gave us, the cognitive sciences seem to do a lot of heavy lifting. Right. You apply this from sort of older version of neoliberalism done in either religion or epistemology, old school information processor, towards a new model in which we try to build the new politics using the cognitive sciences. And I was wondering whether whether you could say a bit more about the nature of that new language, neural, cognitive, and whether or not that makes these ideas, which essentially like extreme ideas, more capable of fusion. You mentioned briefly Pinker. Now, if you take somebody like Pinker, who is, arguably not an outright person, but in his last book, Rationality, tells a story which is very much the Buchanan story about the prairie. We're full of biases because with a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people are stuck in the Pleistocene prairie.
Okay.
Right?
Perfect.
And on the face of it, it's against the MAGA crowd, right? Because they believe in conspiracy theories, because they have a very hyperactive agency detector, and that's useful back in the savannah when you can be ambushed by other tribes or by wild animals.
Sure.
But and it's not natural to switch it off.
Yes.
And then he adds only the weird one counts, by which he means Western, educated, industrialized, rich democratic.
Right.
And it's it's almost sort of a euphemism.
Yeah.
You can replace Western with white, and you've got something that is very much within scope.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether these ideas are not now set to become dominant by virtue of the sort of piggybacking on the sort of cognitive sciences that are indeed a lot of wind in that sails at the moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you.
Actually, hold on for 1 second.
Yeah.
Let's do one more right behind Nicholas.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the climate crisis, and particularly how the sort of narrative of siege and scarcity lends itself to, as a response to narratives about the climate crisis. I guess my question is, what extent are the thinkers you're engaging with engaging with that or crafting that, and are, the alternative ways to think about this that avoid.
Yeah, no, both good questions. So on the first one, I mean, Nicholas, I think, that I would almost take that more as a comment than a question, in the sense that I appreciate exactly what you're saying, and I think that's exactly right, that there is a way that a lot of ideas of Western superiority are now just laundered through this new language of evolutionary psychology. The weird one was one of the weirder ones, right? Because there was like, that made a splash and was like a kind of a quirky title, but it was really just the same old like Rise of the West, kind of repackaged with the word weird. So there's a lot more just now Ferguson language, another Montpellier Society member, by the way, in all of this than we would think. But I think I can say one more thing on that, which helps also to answer Ed's primary question about the difference between race and IQ and why I hold them apart. Because race functions for the people in the book not just as a proxy for intellectual capacity, but also as a basis for forms of trust, and also as they call it openly, the decreasing of transaction costs. So the idea is, within more ethnically homogeneous communities, you can actually get closer to a stateless ideal, because people will more naturally see each other as peers, and we're more unlikely to see each other as potentially traitorous or betraying them. So there's that functional attitude that is also horizontal and not just vertical. And then also it plugs into a longer story through the language of cultural evolution that Hayek constructs about some population groups, which can be helpfully described as racial, as having developed over time certain market traits, which are very hard to emulate or transmit to others. So race is a justification for imperialism and the existing hierarchies. It's a part of a blueprint for post-state trust building communities, and it's a way of deciding sort of inclusion and exclusion in a competitive environment. And and the climate crisis. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I haven't thought about it as much as I could have. I think that the way that climate stuff appears, and it appears very early. We're talking about early 1990s. Fred Smith, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Heartland Institute, are, as we know from histories of the environmental movement, there was a really impressive wave in the late 80s and early 90s that in some ways then subsided, only to reemerge later. And so they were right on it. And we know this from, rescues in Conway and the stuff that like the Salvage Collective is doing now about neoliberals and the Zekin Collective against the environmental movement. Whether or not it's always an interesting question about whether it's the people who are the most vehemently denialist who are also the truest believers in climate change, because they're the ones who see it as something that will scramble politics. So you do need to take extreme positions to get out ahead of it. I think that if you believe, as the tech community does, that you need basically limitless energy supplies for the AI revolution, if you're doing the kind of things that Elon Musk is doing in Memphis, which is just bringing in flatbed trailers with methane-powered generator turbines on them against all local regulations, fire up Grok and get it, generating more and more insights for him, then it's the question, are you the most climate conscious person or the least? Because in some ways you realize oh, fuck, we have a limited time window, things are going to start changing, popular anger is going to rise. We need to basically speed run a lot of this technology as long as this stuff is still accessible. So they are very climate alert and aware, but not in the sense that they want to mitigate it at all, obviously.
Okay, I'm going to take 3 last questions. Please keep them short and with a question mark at the end rather than a comment point. So Steve Milder, and in front of the back window, and here in the front.
Thanks, I really enjoyed the talk. I was wondering about the tensions between a interest in going back to nature and then a sort of nostalgia for the Cold War era, because in some of the things you're talking about, the traditional family and and also the problem of environmentalism, there's this big narrative that those are all things that broke down starting in the 70s. And I'm wondering if there is any space for sort of nostalgia for the 50s and 60s among these people, and also whether there's a difference maybe between the far right in the United States and in Europe as far as some of those topics are concerned, or if you would say it's just sort of like a wrong way of looking at it, that there is no nostalgia whatsoever for that era among these people.
Yeah, one in the back there.
Yeah, so I unfortunately share Ed's cursed interest in the neo-reactionaries, in part because I'm from Singapore and they seem to venerate my beloved God King Lee Kuan Yew. I wonder if we sort of think with like Raymond Williams' structure of feeling, are these neo-reactionaries just kind of struggling to find a desperate way out of the present moment and out of the constraints of neoliberalism? And yeah, how seriously should we take them as a threat if they're trying to build, you know, something more durable or like create an ideological current they can coast on to success? And yeah, how do we counter this sort of current?
So I have like two quick questions. One is about ourselves, not about them, which is our lack of capacity to collectively diagnose what they are. Although, I mean, this conversation started with you asking, no one is wondering about economy when we saw the people in the street, which is peculiar because we already experienced fascism. And what you describe about like their vision of economy and social order, it's more or less the same, and I work on that differently. So like most of the things are visible, they have the same language, they have imagined the same anti-statist, ultra-capitalist society back in the day, and we already got through that. So how did you manage to forget what they are? And I looked about on the book, Ash is not really quoted, but he had this amazing piece where he pointed out the economical structure underlying the rise of fascism back in the day. And my other little question is, are we not also fooling ourselves with immigration? Because they never struck me as being anti-immigration. The problem is that we all have the same right. So if tomorrow morning we organize our very hierarchical world that they imagine, they wouldn't have problem with open borders as long as those people stay isolated, not mix, not spread their vicious gene among us. And because we need working forces and they need them and they know that they need them. So their problem is not immigration per se, is the fact that when you immigrate, you became a member of the community.
Yeah. Okay, great. So a few small questions at the end. I'll start with, and I remember we had in Florence, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Someone asked me about this also last night, I think, about it's like a feature of the capitalist destructionism of the capitalist radicals in a way that they have such an absolute idea of exclusion, because isn't the more functional capitalist radical attitude towards workers the one of Singapore and Dubai, which I describe in Crack Up Capitalism, which is like, actually, it's fine. Let them come, give them no rights, deport them whenever you deport them at will. And that's actually how you keep capitalism going. The idea which some people do, and I think that Hannah's right, that, you know, that's where Brimelow kind of is a bit harder to get your head around. I mean, if you are wanting to talk about reducing in the Bannonite way, you know, net immigration to well, maybe zero, then how do you expect the current growth model to persist? And are you being disingenuous about the consequences of that or the economic expectations of the population? I think you would be. You know, you're obviously undercutting the average expectations of access to a population. So I think there's two ways of thinking about it. This is the way I lay it out in the chapter about what I call the ethno-economy, because we are used to talking about the ethno-state. You might see that in the New York Times, even talking about the far right. But in fact, you're exactly right. Keep on also repeating the Horkheimer thing. You know, he does not want to talk about capitalism, shouldn't talk about fascism. And yet, so infrequently do we talk about capitalism when we talk about the far right, that it seems like statism and emotion and, you know, ethnic affiliation, blood and soil stands in for everything. And the way that this interrelates with the set of property relations doesn't. So in that chapter about the ethno-economy, I say, you know, in the 1990s, two systems emerged that were actually quite different from what pre-existed it. In the late 1980s, the Wall Street Journal was calling for open borders every 4th of July, full open borders. The same column, criticizing the militarization of the border. Unimaginable now. By the 90s, there's two positions, either the hard nativist, one based on ethnic identity, or what Fukuyama and Van Wattenberg called designer immigration, which is a more points-based system, a more skill-based one. So it's basically Ramaswamy versus Bannon in December of last year, but in 1992. And they set the stage that we're still, existing on. So, I basically just share your frustration with the way that conversation has mostly avoided that. On the question of new reaction, yes, absolutely, they're flailing and trying to figure out new strategies and structures of feeling. Well, I don't know if you said they were failing, because it doesn't feel like they are. It feels like they're actually moving from strength to strength right now.
I said they were desperate.
They're desperate. Yes, but in their desperation, they're finding a lot of territory. I mean, this weekend in Cambridge, where I live, Curtis Yarvin will be debating, and Daniel Allen, one of our leading political theorists. Ed was just extensively quoted in a great article about this in The Guardian today. But their willingness to radically remix ideas of legitimacy creation and administration and public-private relationships is obviously paying off for them for reasons that we're all still trying to figure out. Finally, to Stephen's question at the back, yeah, no, return to nature is a funny one, right? Because if you think about it in terms of a culture-nature binary, or returning to nature meaning, going back to the land, then that's clearly not what they're doing. I think that, what they're doing is posing the question of social order in scientific terms in a way that seems a little bit novel, or at least, we haven't seen that much of in recent decades. So it wouldn't be enough for me to say it's just, recalling the 1950s domestic arrangement in the underrated film "Don't Worry, Darling," I think it's called, right? It's actually a pretty interesting film about like the convergence of crypto communities and traditionalists trying to create an imaginary world where everything's like the 50s again. I don't think it's quite like that. I think there is an imperative for some reason for them to explain what they're doing also in terms of much longer range developments of what the human is and the human animal distinction, which is trying to set this on more solid ground than just a passing mode of social organization. They're trying to say, no, this is not just the 50s. This is how humans are in like some kind of a deep way. And that's where I think a lot of the intellectual attraction is, especially for young, curious minds, because of the scale of the ambition.
I think this brings us to a close. Thank you, Michel, who's been waiting
He's
patiently.
like a garden. He looks fine.
Thank you.